In this screencast, you will be introduced to the brain and specifically the cerebrum. You can find information on these topics in Chapter 12 of your textbook. The brain is a very sophisticated organ, and the human brain is the most sophisticated compared to the brains of other animals. And there is much we don't know about the brain, and of what we know, we're only going to cover a small amount. The study of the anatomy and physiology of the brain itself could be a course. The goal of this chapter is not to make you an expert on the brain, but simply to provide you with a working knowledge of the brain. In lab, we focused on the anatomy, and we're going to apply that anatomy now and focus on the physiology of the brain and its parts. That is, looking at what different portions of the brain actually do. The knowledge that you gain in this class will provide you with the foundation that you need to build upon as you move through your academic path, whether that be nursing or medical school or some other health science career. The learning objectives of the screencast are as follows. Describe the cerebrum. List the 5 lobes of the cerebrum. Describe the distribution of gray and white matter in the cerebrum. Define association, projection, and commissural tracts, and define a nuclei. Define cognition and list examples of cognitive functions. Describe sensory and association areas and explain how they are related. The cerebrum is the largest region of the brain, and it's the most superficial portion of the brain, at least the superior portion of the brain. You're looking at the cerebrum here, and the cerebrum is divided into what are called 2 cerebral hemispheres by this deep longitudinal fissure that runs right down the midline of the brain. Again, this is called the longitudinal fissure, and it separates the cerebrum into a right cerebral hemisphere and a left cerebral hemisphere. This is a lateral view of the brain. Here we have the cerebrum again, and notice that the cerebrum is separated from another region of the brain, the cerebellum here, by another fissure. This is called the transverse fissure because it's in the transverse plane. The cerebrum is divided into 5 paired lobes, 4 of which are shown here. And these 4 shown here are named after the bones that lie over top of them. We have the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe that is posterior to that, and then posterior and inferior is the occipital lobe and the temporal lobe. And these different lobes lie somewhat close to the cranial bones that lie over top of them. In addition to those 4 lobes, there is a 5th paired lobe called the insula or insular lobe, and it is deep to lying underneath the temporal, parietal, and frontal lobes. We're now looking at a frontal section of the cerebrum, and we can notice that the cerebrum contains 3 basic regions. The cerebral cortex is the outer portion of the cerebrum. Cortex means bark, like the bark of a tree. And of course, the bark of the tree is the most superficial part of a tree. So cortex in human anatomy and physiology always refers to the outside. So the cerebral cortex is this outer portion which is composed of gray matter. Deep to the gray matter is, of course, the white matter. If you recall, gray matter consists of cell bodies and unmyelinated axons. White matter consists of myelinated axons. So where are most of the neuron cell bodies in the cerebrum? They're right here on the surface in the cerebral cortex. And their myelinated axons extend deep into the brain. All this white matter here are the myelinated axons that are extending from the cell bodies, which are found here in the cerebral cortex. Notice that we do have some little isolated islands of gray matter, and these are collectively referred to as the basal nuclei, or a better word for it would be brain nuclei. I'm sure you've noticed that the cerebral cortex is thrown into ridges and grooves. We refer to those ridges as gyri or gyrus, singular, and we refer to the grooves as a sulcus or sulci. And again, notice that the white matter of the cerebrum is deep to the gray matter cerebral cortex. Let me take a moment to formally explain why white matter is white and gray matter is gray. So if we look at this image of a neuron here on the left, neuron has two major regions. You have the cell body and you have the processes. And specifically, we're going to focus on the process which we call the axon. And this is a myelinated axon where either oligodendrocytes or Schwann cells wrap themselves around the axon to form this very white colored or white-ish axon, and that is this difference in coloration between the cell bodies and a myelinated axon is what's responsible for gray and white matter. So where we have either unmyelinated axons or neuron cell bodies, that's gray matter, and where we have myelinated axons, that's white matter. So again, the cell bodies are located in the cerebral cortex, and deep to that would be the myelinated axons of those cells. Let's focus on the white matter for a moment. So white matter consists of myelinated axons, and those myelinated axons are bundled together into structures called tracts. And of course, these tracts are going to carry action potentials from one portion of the brain to another. And depending on the origin and destination of those tracts, we classify them either as association tracts, commissural tracts, or projection tracts. Association tracts, shown here in red, carry information from one gyrus to the next within the same cerebral hemisphere. While an association tract carries information from one hemisphere to the next, commissural fiber tracts, shown here in green, carry information from one hemisphere to the other. So you're looking at an image of a frontal view of the brain. So here we have the right hemisphere, here is the left hemisphere, and we've got commissural tracts here that are carrying information from between, I should say, the right and left hemispheres. If you recall from a lab, you had to identify this large white structure called the corpus callosum. Corpus callosum is composed of commissural tracts that allow communication between gray matter in the right hemisphere and gray matter in the left hemisphere. And lastly, we have projection fiber tracts. And projection fiber tracts carry information between the cerebral cortex and lower regions of the brain, as shown here in sort of a purple color. So communication between, say, the cerebrum and the diencephalon, or the diencephalon and the brainstem, etc. Now that we've discussed the white matter, let's turn our attention to the gray matter. So white matter is composed of fiber tracts. Gray matter are composed of nuclei. A nuclei is simply a cluster of cell bodies. Most of our nuclei are found in the cerebral cortex. So while most gray matter is found in the cerebral cortex, you do have some little islands of gray matter that exist deep in the cerebrum surrounded by white matter, and we'll discuss one of these called the basal nuclei in a upcoming screencast. Now that you have a basic overview of the cerebrum, or at least its structural organization, now let's look at the functional organization of the cerebrum. And we're going to start with the learning objective of defining cognition and listing examples of cognitive function, and then describing the sensory and association areas of the cerebrum and explain how the two are related. The cerebrum is responsible for cognitive functions, and for that reason, the cerebrum is sometimes referred to as the seat of intelligence, because it's where our higher functions arise. Now, what are some cognitive functions? Well, those would be things like voluntary motor movements, sensory perception, such as something is hot, something is cold, something is itching, something is burning, memory, the ability to plan, your ability to dream or abstractly uh, develop a vision in your mind's eye, reading, calculating, your mood, your judgment about how to interpret someone's emotions or a specific situation. All of these would be examples of cognitive functions. So cognition, in short, is a mental process which requires the acquisition of information and then applying that information. Cognitive functions require significant neural integration, and typically they require different portions of the cerebral cortex, as well as other parts of the brain. Cognitive function is dependent on the processing of information by three areas of the brain. The sensory areas, which are responsible for receiving the sensory information from receptors, the association areas, which are responsible for making sense of the stimuli that was detected, and then the motor areas are responsible for sending signals out to effectors, that is, muscles and glands, to take action based on what was detected and identified. The sensory areas are responsible for perception, your conscious awareness of a stimulus. For example, your ability to see an object as you are seeing these words in front of you now, or your ability to hear my voice, or if you were to put your hand in your pocket, your ability to feel an object that's in your pocket. The sensory areas are responsible for that. The association areas are found close to the sensory areas, and they allow you to make sense of what you sense. So in other words, they apply meaning to what has been perceived. So you can see an object, that's one thing, but your ability to recognize that object as a bird or your friend John is another. That's what the association areas allows you to do. You can hear a voice, sensory area allows that, but your ability to identify that voice as your mom or a famous actor's voice, the association areas allow that. Your ability to feel an object in your pocket, again, that's a sensory function. But your ability to recognize that object that you're feeling as your house key, the association areas are responsible for that function. A large portion of the cerebrum is dedicated to sensation. That is the ability to perceive changes and then to assign meaning or tag that sensation. The primary sensory regions receive stimuli, making you aware of the stimulus, and then you have nearby association areas that interpret that stimulus or assign meaning to it. The sensory and association areas are connected by those association tracts, which connect the gray matter of one gyrus to the gray matter in a nearby gyrus of the same cerebral hemisphere. Now let's review the learning objectives of the screencast. Describe the cerebrum. List the 5 lobes of the cerebrum. Describe the distribution of gray and white matter in the cerebrum. Define association, projection, and commissural tracts. Define nuclei. Define cognition and list examples of cognitive functions. Describe sensory and association areas and explain how they are related.